You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Raincoast Radio, Season 2, More Than a Fish. I'm Auston Chhor, I'm a salmon habitat biologist at Raincoast, and I'm really excited to be your host this season. This season is about salmon, but in many ways it's about a lot more than just that. It's about collaboration, conflict, hope, looking ahead, and looking back. Each of my guests have their own special connection to salmon, and I'm so grateful that I have the opportunity to share their stories with you. My guests today are Allison Dennert and Dave Scott. Allison and Dave are fellow Raincoasters, making this a fully in-house affair today. Allison is our quantitative ecologist, which by her own description means she does a lot of fancy salmon math. Allison works on issues facing salmon out in the ocean and maintains an Excel spreadsheet containing over 100 acronyms related to salmon. Dave is our research and restoration biologist and lead of our habitat restoration efforts in the Lower Fraser and the Fraser estuary. Dave's world is full of hard hats, heavy machinery, seine nets, and baby salmon. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, so we start every episode by asking people where their home waters are. So home waters, as you know, with salmon, very connected to their natal streams by their run timings, by their habitat preferences, life strategies. So where are your home waters? Tell me a bit about them. What are they like? What do they mean to you?
I am from Burnaby, BC, and my home waters are the Brunette River, which is a tributary of the Fraser. The Brunette is a highly modified river with lots of delightful invasive plant species, but it supports some small populations of salmon. It's a really neat river in an urban area.
For myself, I'm originally from Saskatchewan, so a little bit different. I grew up spending summers on a small lake in Saskatchewan called Marine Lake, where I learned how to swim and fish and drive a boat. And so, yeah, a long ways away from any salmon, but that's kind of where I started my connection with water back in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, including me, started out in lakes and moved out here to moving water. And so both of you have been in the salmon field for quite some time now. Both of you have your PhDs. Could you tell me a little bit more about your paths toward this? Was it more of a straight line where you always knew you wanted to do something like this? Or did you, bounce from place to place and finally land where you are today?
Yeah, for me, I always knew that I wanted a career outside, and science is such a fun job to have because you get to ask questions about the world and have them answered each day. And I knew that I had wanted some kind of ecology career. And for a while there, I thought I was going to work on like the evolution of kelp, perhaps, or maybe freshwater fishes. But I had the privilege of spending a summer in Bristol Bay, and I saw one of the best salmon runs in the world. And from there, it was history. I haven't worked on anything but salmon since.
Yeah, I feel like I had a somewhat similar path. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do going into my undergrad, and then I knew I wanted to do science. And then once I learned about kind of field biology, I quickly decided, that's what I wanted to do. After getting a chance to spend some time out on the coast, out at the Banfield Marine Sciences Center, got the idea that I wanted to do something kind of related to that and started working in aquatic ecology. And then, yeah, similar to Allison, eventually found my way to SFU where I worked with a different John than she did, but with the kind of two Johns of salmon at SFU, John Reynolds and John Moore. John Moore was my supervisor, so he was the one who really turned me on to salmon in particular as a topic. And then, yeah, that was about 12 years ago, and then I've always worked on salmon ever since. So,
Yeah, I find it really interesting that all of us have this like one moment or experience outside in a really, really cool place that led us to this flip towards, the career. And so, Dave, you mentioned the Johns or one of the Johns. Allison, did you also have that person who was your salmon coach or your salmon mentor?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't work on salmon at the time when I worked with him, but Dr. Rick Taylor at UBC, I had the privilege of doing some undergrad work with him, and he's the one that ended up sending me to Alaska. And at the time, I was working on the evolution of dolly varden and Arctic char because that one place in Alaska is the area in North America where they both co-occur, and they're really similar species in the salmon family. And there's lots of hybridization and interbreeding in the salmon family, and it's a really great group of species to ask questions about evolution and how new species come to be. And so that's why I was there, which was really fascinating. But once you're, in a place where you're studying things in the salmon family, but you're inundated with millions and millions of sockeye salmon. You can't help but work on anything else. But yeah, for me, it was working with Rick Taylor.
Do you both have a favorite part about your job that you can identify?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of flexibility in the different things that I get to do as part of my job these days. So I get to go out in the field and work with our field crews and catch salmon and do all that kind of fun field work stuff that I really fell in love with as a field biologist. But also now as our director of our restoration program in the Fraser, I also get to come up with our restoration projects from start to carrying them all the way through to the finish line, which after working on a project for, a couple of years, actually going out to site when it's under construction and then going out and doing the monitoring after it's finished is just like super rewarding. So I would say, yeah, being able to actually put a restoration project into the ground is probably my new favorite part of my job.
I love that every day my job is different. I get to do lots of field work, which obviously every field biologist loves, but each day I get to meet with different people or work on different projects. Like no day is the same and it's never monotonous. Like as a scientist, you always get to be learning new things and be challenged by the things that you don't know about salmon, and it feels like your knowledge base is constantly being challenged and expanding, which is also satisfying, but maybe not as satisfying as restoring degraded salmon habitat.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear this from both of you because you both are very passionate scientists and really great at your jobs. But is there something that's like, this is the thorn in my side about my job, or something that's the most challenging about your job?
Yeah, I feel like, it changes over time. I think, with the restoration piece, it's really challenging to kind of find areas along the Lower Fraser that aren't already being developed or kind of overdeveloped. So just like having to fight against that level of development and just like the level of cost of everything makes it like a pretty substantial challenge a lot of the time. And yeah, just seeing, projects that continue to go on that kind of take away those last little bits of habitat, I think is probably the most frustrating thing right now. But, we've been pretty fortunate recently over the years, have built like so many good relationships with all the different municipalities and nations and levels of government that I think things have gotten a lot easier and better in that way. So a lot less thorn in my sides than there used to be.
For me, I have the privilege of working lots with folks in the federal government, and there's a lot of really dedicated folks that do salmon work in the federal government, but the speed of large bureaucracies tends to be really slow, and the kinds of policy changes that you might want to see on timelines that are relevant to salmon are often a lot quicker than the speed of government movement. So that can be challenging at times and somewhat frustrating. And you wonder, whether or not the action that you're taking now is going to be quick enough to help this particular population before it's extirpated. So that can be challenging.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought you were going to say, but I was going to say like the yelling.
There's not actually that much yelling. I feel like maybe we exaggerate sometimes. Like it's just a lot of passionate people.
This is kind of why we're calling the podcast More Than a Fish. We're not just talking about any old fish. We're talking about how they connect to people and how they connect to, how people value them, right? We want to provide listeners with some fundamental background info on salmon, the life cycle. We got Allison here who works more in the salmon adult phase, and Dave is focusing on the juvenile phase a lot of the times. And so I'd like to start with Dave. If you could give me a short rundown of a little bit about the life of a juvenile salmon. You can use the Fraser as an example and just tell me about like, where do they live? Like, what does the ecosystem and the habitat look like where they live? What do they eat? Like, what eats them? And where do they go? That sort of thing.
There's a huge diversity of life histories for juvenile salmon. So not to make things like overly complicated, but juvenile salmon basically kind of have two choices in their early life. They can either go to the ocean within the first few months of life when they're, just literally like a few months old out of the gravel, or they can stick around in fresh water for a longer period and grow and get a bit bigger before they go to the ocean. So we have our sockeye and some chinook and coho that generally will spend a whole year in freshwater. So they'll come out of the gravel once they've hatched out of their egg in the spring, but then they'll stay in a freshwater environment. So sockeye, they'll stay in a lake. Chinook or coho, they'll stay in a freshwater stream, and they'll stay there for a whole year where they'll feed and grow, and they'll, have kind of like a little territory where they like to hang out. And then the second spring, they'll go out to the ocean. And so those fish are known as yearling fish. They're going to the ocean a little bit bigger, and they're generally kind of making their way from that freshwater habitat down through the river and then kind of straight out to the ocean. And so that's one group of fish. And then we have another group of fish, which are some other types of Chinook. And then we have chum and pink that are moving down to the ocean in their first year of life. So those are generally the ones that we spend more time doing our research on, because they're the ones that are coming down through the river and then spending a bunch of time in the Lower Fraser and in the Fraser estuary as juveniles. So spending a few weeks there, even up to a few months, using those estuary habitats. So going into marsh areas that are along the side of the river, off channel marsh areas, and into these tidal habitats where they're going to be doing some feeding in the estuary and then transitioning to the ocean still within that first year of life. So those are the ones that I spend the most time looking at, those ones that move when they're just a few months old and then kind of stop in the estuary, use marsh areas, and then kind of make their way out to the ocean when they're just still only a few months old. So those are the kind of two different strategies that salmon generally have.
And is there that much diversity in what they eat as well?
Yeah, so it really depends on kind of where they are and which species they are. So when you're looking at the different species of salmon that we have, there's a few like Chinook and coho that when they're becoming kind of larger juveniles and moving into more mature stages, they really rely on eating other fish. So they need to be able to grow really fast and allow their mouths essentially to grow really fast so that they can eat larger items. Whereas something like a pink or a chum that's a little bit smaller, they're going to mostly rely on little insects. So basically what we call zooplankton. So that's kind of more what they rely on as food. So they don't need to necessarily grow their mouths quite as fast because they're eating kind of those smaller prey items. And then when we look at salmon as well in the estuary, it's really a matter of like where they are. So one of our colleagues, Paige, who studies juvenile Chinook salmon diets, has really found that, when they're in the marsh areas, they're eating a lot of insects, a lot of things that are kind of associated with more of the terrestrial environment. So like fly larvae and those kinds of things. But then as soon as they start to transition to the outer estuary, they're switching over to eating things like crab larvae and then quickly switching to eating like really small larval fish that are things like herring and smelt and sand lance. So it really depends on kind of how big the fish is and where it is in the estuary.
Yeah, and so now the fish are in the ocean, salmon are in the ocean, they're growing bigger. I'll move over to Allison to tell me now what happens. They've left the estuary, they've gotten big enough. Where do they go?
Yeah, well, it depends what species you are and what life history type of what species. But generally, they spend between 1 and 6 years in the North Pacific, eating, feeding, growing. We don't know exactly the migration route of every species, but we have rough ideas generally of where each population might spend its time.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a little kid here, like who wants like one straight answer.
Yeah,
And both of you guys are like kind of like giving me the runaround, like, well, it depends. And whenever we talk about this, there's so much variation in salmon. Salmon aren't just one type of fish. They're not even just 5 species. They're like so diverse, and they do so many different things. So it's kind of like a great answer, but it's kind of like, oh man, like I just wanted to, they just go here or they just eat this. Okay, but what about the adults? Do they must eat the same thing, right?
It's going to depend a lot on the gape width of the fish.
Oh, that depends.
Yeah, so how large the fish's mouth is and also where it spends its time in the North Pacific. But oftentimes as they grow older, they'll eat fishes smaller than them. So herring is an important prey species for Chinook, for example. Yeah, it really, honestly, it depends.
The thing about the adults too is like when I picture a salmon in a stream, I can see what it looks like. It's like a clear water, there's lots of wood and it's swimming around. But when I picture a salmon in the ocean, I don't know what that mental picture is. Is there one that fits? Like, are they swimming around in the deep ocean with no structure? Are they in the kelp forests? Are they near rocks?
In their adult phase, they're usually in the middle of the water column and not spending a whole lot of time in coastal waters unless you're a shelf rearing sort of a species. So the species that spend a lot of time offshore are spending a lot of time in places that have very deep water, but they're in the middle of the water column, more towards the surface, but not right on the surface. So they're not in the warmest of waters.
So geographically, would this mean that salmon are not spending that much time in the Salish Sea between Vancouver Island and BC, and they are all fully off in the middle of the Pacific?
For the most part, unless you're a shelf resident. So there's a group of Chinook salmon that spend the majority of their life rearing on the continental shelf. And so they're a special case, but the other species of salmon will go offshore in the North Pacific and make this sort of really large clockwise migration in the couple of years of their life that they're out at sea.
One thing I want to kind of wrap up this Salmon 101 section is with a question for both of you is, what is the most common question you get from people not in the salmon world about your work?
I always get questions about what salmon folks should eat, which is also a very difficult question to answer. But that's usually the first thing is, should I be eating salmon and what salmon should I eat and where can I source the seafood that I want to be eating?
What do you usually give them?
It's challenging. If it depends on how much time they have or their interest. If they only have a couple of minutes, usually I'll direct them towards some really great eco-labeling programs like OceanWise or the Marine Stewardship Council, but those also have their challenges as well. And so if they have a little bit more time, we can talk about some of the challenges with those programs. Sourcing seafood from local fishmongers is really great. And there are a few different companies in British Columbia where you can source food directly from fishers, which is wonderful. And that usually helps keep some of the money within the industry in British Columbia instead of, multinational companies.
What about you, Dave?
I think the most common question I always get is just like, how are the salmon doing this year? And of course, like the answer is all to that is also like, it depends.
It
depends.
But this year there's some bright spots, it seems like, in the Fraser, so that's good at least.
Let's move on to talking about your actual work and your research. And we'll start with Allison. So I remember when you first joined Raincoast, you had this paper published that kind of made you like somewhat of a scientific celebrity.
Oh, no.
It was like in the news. I think it was in CBC or it was in one of the big papers. And it was on the relationship between salmon and plants. And so without me leading too much into it, could you give me a Cliff's Notes of what that experiment was and why it was so cool and compelling?
Yeah, so I was really interested in knowing how salmon or nutrients from salmon after the salmon had spawned out were influencing life on land. And particularly, I wanted to know about the relationships between different species on land. And so I, for my PhD work, was looking at the relationship between plants and their pollinators. And you're like, well, how do salmon affect bees and flies? Well, what I ended up doing was I had this huge experiment in an estuary wildflower meadow where annually we would go and collect a few hundred salmon carcasses, and we would put them in the meadow in this locked design that was pretty regulated, and we would leave them there for the year, and then we'd come back the following spring and we'd monitor the plants that were growing in and around each plot and also the pollinators that visited those plants. And so in that particular study, we ended up finding that certain species of plants grow larger leaves. So they take all of those nutrients from salmon like nitrogen and phosphorus, and they invest them in their photosynthetic structure. So they make, big solar panels that can collect more energy from the sun. But some species grow larger and more showy flowers to attract pollinators to those particular flowers as well. So it was sort of a multifaceted project. We were looking at, how are nutrients from salmon affecting the plants, but also how do those nutrients affect the way that pollinators interact with those plants?
And could you detect the actual salmon or traces of salmon in the plants themselves, or were they just bigger and the ones that were bigger were the ones with the salmon?
Yeah, over the last 20 or so years, people are using an isotope of nitrogen called nitrogen 15, and people call it sort of like the salmon signature. And it's a signature that indicates that salmon are really high up in the marine trophic level because nitrogen 15 accumulates up trophic levels. And so when you find it in places on land, it usually is a signature that there's something of a really high trophic level from the ocean that was nearby here. And so that's what people use to trace salmon in coastal forests. But there's some complexities there with, what kind of nitrogen the plants are using. Are they using regular nitrogen 14 or 15, or is it preferential in different places? But yeah, that's usually how people sort of trace the presence of salmon in coastal ecosystems is with that isotope.
So your team was going out there and grabbing the salmon, dead, alive,
Dead, yes.
dead, dead, tossing them onto the bank methodically. What about in other systems where you weren't there, tossing the salmon onto the bank? How do they get there?
In a lot of places, there are predators like bears and coastal wolves that will drag these carcasses up onto the riverbanks. And in the places where I was working on the central coast of BC, there are really small rain dominated systems that are quite flashy. And so flooding can also bring carcasses onto land. And there's also, flow underneath the stream bed called hyporheic flow that also has nutrient exchange on land. So there's multiple different ways those nutrients can make their way in.
So it's almost like the river itself is just carrying fertilizer in it and it's watering the plants with the fertilizer.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was a pretty novel study. Why do you think, though, that it got picked up so much by the media?
Well, first of all, the story of like how you do the field work where you're just carrying a bunch of rotting salmon carcasses in bear country can usually be of interest to people. But I think for many decades, people knew, okay, like, salmon, you can trace the salmon signature in trees, but it was sort of like, all right, so what? Like, what are these plants actually doing with this nitrogen? And how is that impacting other groups of species other than just plants, all of the organisms that depend on plants like pollinators. And so it was sort of making these interconnections beyond just plants as well. But I think it was probably the story of carrying dead fish in bear country.
I feel like what also it did was confirm a lot of a lot of people will bury stuff in their garden and notice that their tomatoes grow bigger. And it's really cool to see that there is empirical hard evidence behind that practice that we've, known about intuitively for a long, long, long time.
Yeah, and that includes the Celtic Nation whose territory I was working in. These results were of no surprise. Lots of folks will use the carcasses from the salmon that they fish to fertilize their raspberry beds, for example, or their tomatoes. So a lot of people were like, "Oh yeah, that makes intuitive sense. I've been doing this for a long time."
So I've been up there to the Central Coast, and one of the big problems up there that I've learned about is how salmon are declining. The runs are declining year over year. Dramatic declines in chum in particular, around like 90%, since like the 70s or the 80s. So with these declines, like, is there a risk that you are losing this fertilization mechanism? How much of an impact is that going to have?
Yeah, it's not only just the numbers of salmon that are declining, but also the general size of salmon that's declining over time. And so you have this giant annual pump of fertilizer. And yeah, there's potential for that to be lost. And globally, not just salmon, we have all kinds of we call them biotic nutrient pumps in all kinds of different ecosystems that are typically driven by large carnivores. And so with the decline of large carnivores, we're seeing a decline in the capacity for these ecosystems to pump nutrients. So yeah, it's a pretty widespread problem.
So less salmon coming in and then less bears and wolves to drag them out and move them into the forest, you're saying?
Exactly.
Let's move on to Dave. And Dave works in a very, very different place than the Central Coast of BC. He works near home, near where most of us live in Lower Mainland. And one thing I learned about Dave was that he was one of the founding members of a group called the Still Creek Streamkeepers. And could you tell me a little bit more about that group and what its mission was or is?
Yeah, for sure. So the Still Creek Streamkeepers is just a community group that's under the umbrella of the Still Moon Art Society. And basically, when I started working with Raincoast back in 2015, we did a lot of work going around and talking to lots of different community groups throughout the Lower Mainland who work on a specific creek. And I was living in East Vancouver, really close to Still Creek, and I saw a news story about how Still Creek had chum returning to it for the first time in basically 100 years because Metro Vancouver had installed a fishway on the Caribou Dam. And I went down and I was observing the chum salmon spawning there, and I found out that there was no actual community group for that creek. That's like, basically the one creek in the city of Vancouver that is still above ground that had spawning salmon. So I spoke with the Still Moon Art Society, who had been doing some stewardship around the creek, and they kind of helped me get some folks together and essentially start the Still Creek Streamkeepers. And then they've really, kind of taken that on as a part of their organization. And for years since then, we've done, garbage cleanups. We've done a lot of invasive species removals and plantings, and just a lot of work around some of the few little sections of Still Creek that are actually above ground, because there's still a big portion of the creek that actually is below ground in pipes. But there is a section where salmon actually do come up and at least attempt to spawn. And so now there's dozens of folks that participate regularly in these activities. It's been really great to see. There's a whole section of the creek that the city had actually had a developer spend money to daylight this section of creek, and it was like a nice section of creek where the chum were coming up to spawn, and there was a nice mural, but nobody took care of it. There was no community group, so it got completely taken over by blackberry. It wasn't even possible to see the chum salmon coming there to spawn. And so that group has basically, over the last 5-8 years, made sure that that area now is more or less reduced in the amount of blackberry and other invasives, has some native plants there, and there's actually opportunities now to go and observe the adult spawning fish. So that's kind of the main activities of the group, and then working with the art society as well.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Still Creek, if I'm getting this right, runs through a real Canadian Superstore parking lot. The SkyTrains runs over it. It's like right in the heart of kind of like semi-industrial, light industrial East Van and Burnaby, right?
Yeah, so basically, Still Creek, it starts in East Vancouver, kind of near the 29th Avenue SkyTrain station, and then it runs through some pipes underground, and then it runs past Superstore, behind a Canadian Tire and a Walmart, and then it goes underneath the number one highway, and then, through a pretty industrialized, like you said, light industrial area, and then kind of flows through a lumber yard, and then before kind of flowing through more of a greenway area and into the city of Burnaby. But despite all of that, it is, one of the only remaining creeks in the city of Vancouver that's above ground, when there used to be dozens of these little salmon creeks that used to exist.
And before the formation of the group, was there a lot of like local community knowledge that there were even salmon in this little, like what people would probably look at as a ditch?
Yeah, so basically, what had happened was back, decades ago, the whole system had become very polluted. It's kind of an interesting system because it doesn't run down towards False Creek. It actually runs through the city of Vancouver back towards Burnaby into Burnaby Lake. And then the outfall of Burnaby Lake is the Brunette River and then into the Fraser River. And so that whole area, including the Brunette River, had become very polluted, and they had built a dam on Burnaby Lake. And so there was no way for fish to actually get up and come back and spawn in Still Creek. But back in, I think, around 2010 or so, they built a fishway that actually allowed fish to now bypass that dam into Burnaby Lake. And so when that happened, there was some work that some other community folks had done. There had kind of previously been a Still Creek Streamkeeper group that had then kind of faded away, but DFO had done some stalking of some of these small creeks above the dam once that work had been undertaken to have that fishway. And so it's really kind of a combination of efforts of having that fishway in place. I think a lot of improvement in the water quality in the Brunette River to allow fish to get up that high, and then actually going and stalking. And so Still Creek stream keepers, we're still working with Fisheries and Oceans Canada to put some juvenile chum salmon from a hatchery into the creek each spring to, really to keep trying to jumpstart that population of chum in the creek that was, lost for decades and decades because of a variety of different actions in the area.
So you're saying there's salmon in Burnaby Lake where all the ducks are and all the people feed all the ducks.
Yeah, so there's several tributaries that come into Burnaby Lake. There's another one called Eagle Creek, and there's several more. And yeah, each one actually has its own streamkeeper group. They're really small groups, but they exist. And there's both chum salmon and coho salmon that come through the system. And one of the neat things is that the fishway that comes through the Caribou Dam, it has basically like a fish counting box. And so you could actually contact DFO and they could tell you exactly how many coho and exactly how many chum passed through into the Burnaby Lake system each of the last many, many years since they built the fishway.
Allison, as a Burnaby resident and someone who grew up in Burnaby, is this something you grew up doing, checking out the salmon in Burnaby Lake and surrounding?
Yeah, and the Caribou Dam in Brunette River is right where I used to live. And yeah, I would, during the pandemic especially, I would go there pretty much every day during salmon season when I couldn't actually get out to do my own field work. I was counting the fish at the Caribou Dam. But nice to know there's an actual electronic counter there. Maybe I was wasting my time. But yeah, in Burnaby, I feel like growing up in BC, you kind of get like indoctrinated into salmon culture a little early, like you learn about the salmon life cycle. Perhaps you go and visit a hatchery or a stewardship group when you're a kid. And Stony Creek Elementary School in Burnaby actually has an event every year called the Great Salmon Send-Off, where kids get to release salmon into the Stony Creek, which is it feeds into the Brunette River and then into the Fraser. So yeah, growing up as a kid in Greater Vancouver, you spend a lot of time around salmon and learning about salmon. They start them young.
Yeah, I remember biking past Spanish Banks a couple years ago, and there were a couple salmon running up into the, I think, Pacific Spirit Park. And the amount of people, there were lots of signs saying there were salmon there, but the amount of people who would come by and other people would point out the salmon and they would like lose their minds, be like, what? There's no
Yeah.
way. And they could, the magic of seeing salmon in the heart of the city, I feel like is something really special, even though, they're pretty small populations, but just like that value alone, I think, is really, really cool. And I mean, I was there for like half an hour just watching these two chum swim around with a giant audience.
Yeah, and I think Dave makes a good point that, Still Creek is like one of the only open streams. Like lots of the streams have not been daylighted or underground in pipes. And so a lot of these historical populations that we had in Greater Vancouver aren't there any longer. And so the places that you do have them are really special.
We've been talking a lot about habitat restoration or protection, on the estuary, where salmon live, that sort of thing. We know there are other issues, though, facing salmon. I want to let Allison speak on this because you work a lot on fisheries, on the impacts of humans harvesting fish. And so one question I have for you is there one big fisheries problem out there that is trying to get solved? Or, like a lot of our answers today, is it more of a big giant mishmash?
Yeah, it's more of it depends, but a big challenge that we're having right now is that it's not just one threat for salmon that's accumulating over time. It's how all these different threats interact. And so over the last about 25, 30 years, the productivity of the ocean has changed dramatically for lots of different salmon species.
And sorry, what is productivity again?
It's essentially how many little fish come back per big spawner. So, if you've got a certain population, you can almost think of it like accumulating interest on an investment. That's actually sort of how we manage fisheries at a federal level. And so, how many fish were coming back in excess has changed a lot with some of these degraded habitat issues that Dave works on, but also with climate change. And so, what were previously sustainable fishing levels with this decrease in ocean productivity and marine survival has changed the amount that we're able to harvest sustainably in quite a dramatic fashion.
And is the climate change impact warming of the water, or is it something else?
It's warming of the water, but it's what the warming of the water does to the ecosystem in the open ocean. So it shifts the available prey for salmon and the kinds of zooplankton that they're able to eat in any given year.
But isn't there still an impact of the fishing itself, or is it just that there's less fish due to climate change?
It's both. I mean, the kinds of sustainable fishing levels that we used to be able to have are no longer sustainable, but that's because of this climate impact. So it's the two of those impacts together that kind of add up more than the sum of their parts.
Growing up, you hear a lot about the term overfishing, and you just envision or you get these images of like giant boats sweeping nets across the ocean and scooping up all the fish. Is that something that is an issue in the salmon world?
It can depend. We have had some issues with trawl bycatch of Chinook salmon in recent years, but there have been some promising restrictions on bycatch to address some of that problem. But the challenge is really in adequately calculating how many fish can you kind of take off the top of this population interest in a safe way that has completely changed under climate change. And the way that you do those calculations usually assumes a constant environment. And we know that that's not necessarily the case under climate change.
And so for the general public, let's go back to that eating salmon idea. If I were to go to the grocery store and I really, really wanted to eat salmon, how could I do it and feel good about it?
I mean, the answer that I would give is like not the answer that people want to hear in this particular international political climate. But I think that the Bristol Bay sockeye fishery is particularly well managed. So if you can look for Bristol Bay sockeye, but at the grocery store, if all you have time to do is look at a label, try to find packaging that has an eco label like the Marine Stewardship Council or Oceanwise, because having an eco label, if perhaps there's some problems with those certifications, is better than no eco label.
I feel like I want to get into that a little bit more. Like, what are the problems with that? How much can I trust a little sticker that a grocery store slaps on a piece of fish?
So, for the Marine Stewardship Council, it's an international body that has certifications of entire fisheries units. And so they have certain standards for fisheries, like bycatch limits and impacts on endangered stocks, and certain amounts of fisher independent monitoring you might have to have in order to meet the standard of their fishery. Raincoast last year launched an opposition because you can, once certification bodies like the Marine Stewardship Council certify a fishery, you can oppose or provide additional evidence. So Raincoast, along with some of our other partner organizations, launched an opposition to the certification of the Southeast Alaska fisheries. And a challenge that we're having there is that these eco labels don't have a great way to account for the impacts of hatchery production on wild populations. And there's quite a large volume of hatchery production of pink salmon in particular in Alaska, that those impacts in the way that the standard is currently laid out aren't really well accounted for. And also the impacts of mixed stock fisheries or interception fisheries, where fisheries in one jurisdiction intercept fish that may or may not be threatened or endangered from another jurisdiction, is really challenging. And so it's mostly those two things with those particular challenges that we launched in previous years, where you're trying to understand the impacts of hatchery production, but also these interception fisheries on endangered populations, where you might not have great genetic data.
What do you mean by interception fishery?
Yeah, so I spoke earlier about this kind of clockwise migration route for salmon. And generally, it sort of depends on what species and what time of year and where, but the salmon are kind of swirling around in the North Pacific. And then when they come back to spawn, they make landfall in the north first and then kind of swim southwards. And so that means that jurisdictions in the north get first crack at salmon. So typically fish that are returning to spawn in northern BC will make landfall off the coast of Alaska and then travel south, or fish that are going to spawn off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and California might make landfall off of BC. And so there are challenges with who gets whose fish, and that was sort of the genesis of the Pacific Salmon Treaty to address those issues.
This sounds really complicated, and it's understandable that it's not just black and white, but wouldn't it just be easier then to just not eat a wild salmon, to just eat a farmed salmon?
Farmed salmon also has its challenges. We have an increasingly clear understanding that there are pathogens that can be spread from farmed salmon to wild salmon, particularly if those salmon farms are on juvenile migration routes. And so things like sea lice or different viruses can spread to wild populations that wouldn't otherwise be there.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Dave, because I remember being at a restaurant with you and you kind of jokingly or maybe semi-jokingly asking the waiter where the salmon came from, and they had no idea.
I do that all the time.
How much of the onus should be placed on the consumer, to make these informed choices, to do the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a simple thing would be to know where your fish is coming from, right? So, like, if you can't even figure out where it's coming from, then, like, maybe that's not a great option. And, I like to ask, especially at places that bill themselves as more of like a seafood restaurant or something like that. Like, I'd like a better answer than just like, oh, it's from like BC. That doesn't really do the trick for me. I think, it'd be nice to know like what river it's coming from, or what like stock they think it's coming from, or something to that effect. Because if they don't know that, then that's potentially problematic, because then maybe, the middleman, the wholesaler, if they don't know where it's coming from, then it's probably, potentially some kind of mixed stock fishery that's not necessarily sustainable. Whereas, you see certain populations that show up as sustainable more frequently when you go to like an actual, seafood shop, as opposed to going to just like a grocery store. And so, yeah, I would say, like if you're buying it for yourself, like go to like the seafood shop on the block. Don't just go to Safeway to buy your salmon. And like, yeah, when you're at a restaurant, like, yeah, ask them and make sure they know where it's coming from. And I especially tend to avoid farm salmon. So, make sure that you at least know whether you're eating farmed or wild salmon is a good thing to know.
Yeah, farmed or wild, and even just what species. Oftentimes you'll look at a menu at a restaurant, it'll just say, oh, salmon. And you're like, oh, that's maybe some more information is needed.
Yeah, that's very true. As we're talking about salmon, it's not just the species too, right? It's Dave, you said it. What river is coming from? What species and what river is it coming from? That would be, the creme de la creme of knowing where your fish are coming from. Question for both of you is, now that you've been in the field for so long, what's next for your work? What kind of plans are you hatching?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always just like a constant evolution of what we're doing as an organization. When I first started working in the Lower Fraser and estuary, we didn't really have much of a presence here, and we told folks that we were committed to working in this area for 5 years. And so now at the 10-year mark, we're really trying to increasingly kind of look at the bigger picture of what we can do in terms of restoration and impact. And we've done a lot of research already, so now really trying to put that research into action more than anything. But we have to work a lot with different government priorities and the funding that's available to us as well. So we'll have to see how that evolves. But I think increasingly working on how we can evolve our impact in the areas that we're working in as we learn more and more about them through our research, and then combining that with our advocacy and our actions.
It seems like the project that's been taking up a lot of your time for a long time has been the breaches, the jetty breaches out at Steveston, North Arm of the Fraser. These are, massive habitat restoration projects, and they're done. They're fully constructed, right?
Yeah, so that was kind of our starting place with restoration in the estuary. So in the Fraser estuary, there's, this huge conflict between habitat and then also all the industry that takes place. And so, yeah, we have these two really long jetty structures. We've made several large openings in each of those two main jetty structures. And yeah, those projects, the funding has been spent, the breaches have been made. We've been monitoring them for at least all of the breaches now for 2 years, and we've been really happy with the outcome. So we've seen a lot of juvenile salmon passage at our breach sites. And so now we're working on a suite of different restoration projects, moving kind of up into the river and trying to increase the availability of marsh habitat for salmon. So we conducted one large marsh restoration project this past January and February. And right now we have 4 different projects that we're developing that we're hoping to carry out over the next 3 or 4 years. So yeah, 4 more big projects that we're planning, looking at increasing the availability of marsh habitat for salmon, and then we'll just continue on from there.
And Allison, what's next for you?
Yeah, I think a lot about how we can maintain the genetic and ecological diversity of salmon into the future under climate change. And as I mentioned earlier, climate change is changing how we prosecute fisheries and the ways in which we can design fisheries to be more sustainable. And so something that I'm looking at now is, how do we forecast into the future what might be sustainable for any given population, and how do we honor all of these different ecological connections that salmon have with life on land for these individual populations, and moving away from the more traditional ways that we had managed salmon fisheries, like yield-based fisheries on single stocks, to understanding that, salmon are part of a larger ecosystem, and you need to account for all of the potential downstream effects on those populations that depend on salmon as well.
And looking into the future, are you guys hopeful? You guys hopeful for salmon?
I think, there's a lot to be hopeful for with the work that we've been doing. Things have been really interesting for us, with our target group for our restoration in the estuary has been the Harrison River Chinook salmon. And in all the return years since we started our restoration, things have been looking okay. So it's pretty interesting to see. And I think that the public way more than not hears that things are bad with salmon, where there's often things that aren't always so bad. So I think it's a mixed bag, and there's always a lot of reasons to think that salmon are doing poorly, but there's also some good reasons to think that at least some salmon are doing okay.
I agree. I think for me, a reason to be hopeful is that salmon are an incredibly resilient group of species. And if you look over the last couple of million years of their evolutionary history, just the geological and environmental change they've seen during that time has been incredible. And, we've seen all of this genetic diversity that we have in different salmon populations arise because of those environmental challenges. And so they really do have a good foundation for that potential future adaptation under climate change. We just need to make sure that we help them maintain that genetic diversity as much as possible, so that we give them enough lead time to adapt in a changing climate.
With that, how do we help them get there? We're hopeful, they're resilient. How do we set them up for success?
I think, there's some different things that we can do, but we mostly just kind of need to leave them alone and give them their space essentially and give them their water. So, I think those are kind of the most important things that, if salmon are going to be able to adapt to the changing climate and other, changing environments, that the more space that we can give them to live out their life history, to spawn, to create lots of juveniles, then they're going to have some opportunities to adapt. And that's one of the amazing things about salmon. You can go from a small number of individuals to a large number of individuals very quickly because of the sheer number of eggs that each female has. So they have the ability to bounce back, and we need to just make sure that they have enough clean water and habitat in order to have an opportunity to adapt to the various changing climates that they have to deal with.
Yeah. And for me, one of the more depressing things about looking into the future is the amount of cumulative impact for salmon. But the flip side of that is that, there's all of these different things that stack up in negative ways for salmon. It's not just, one potential cause of decline for each particular population. But because there's not one potential cause for decline, that also means there's multiple different actions that people can take to be helpful. So cumulative impacts work in the opposite direction as well. And so whatever ways people can make small contributions to the watersheds where they live, whether that's, cleaning up the habitat or helping plant riparian vegetation so that the stream is shaded and it's a little bit cooler, or taking action on particular land use around where they live, or thinking more carefully about open net pen aquaculture. Like there's tons of little things that people can do every day that have cumulative additive positive effects for salmon as well. You can have a little bit more hope for the future that way as well.
Are there these things that regular everyday non-salmon scientists can do?
Make good seafood choices at the grocery store to the best of your knowledge and ability. I would also say you can vote in federal and provincial and also municipal elections for candidates that care about the environment and the issues facing salmon. And, if you see garbage on the street or things that are in salmon habitat, clean it up. Small actions, they add up.
Yeah, like it ranges from things like working with, these smaller community groups that exist like throughout the Lower Fraser Valley that work on cleaning up habitat, restoring habitat, but also just like creating a voice for salmon, right? When you see that there's that many people that care about salmon, it's hard for the people that make the decisions, like politicians and other folks, not to take notice. So you can even, just like attend things like the Coho Festival in North Vancouver, which is like a fun event. But like if you're, a politician and you see that all these people showed up to support the Coho Festival, like I think that might stick in your mind, that's something that people care about. So I think just making it known that people care, and sharing that with your friends and neighbors or your kids or whatever that is, just going to see the spawning salmon in Vancouver, and just being aware that that's a thing that is happening right here in our own backyards. So it gives us a little more reason to care about simple things like not wasting water and things like that. So yeah, even just those simple actions also matter for salmon, because all that water is coming from a salmon watershed. So
in all your years in the field, both of you, have you had one favorite salmon experience or story?
that's a pretty hard one. I've been doing field work for a really long time now. Outside of my own field work, last year I was out in Banfield working with folks in my lab who are working on a Chinook catch and release project, and we were out there working on capturing Chinook, and we got surrounded by a group of porpoises, and then there was tons of seabirds and just like other life going on. But basically, we were kind of like surrounded by a group of porpoises for like an hour, and they were just coming up like all in a circle all around us. And yeah, that was pretty amazing. So it wasn't for my own work, but that was pretty cool.
What about you, Allison?
Oh man, I'm struggling because I have lots of incredible field memories. I've gotten to spend the better part of a decade working on the Central Coast, and it's just such an incredible part of Canada. I feel like everybody should get a chance to visit if they ever do. Whales, bears, wolves, just an absolute incredible place to work. But I think one of my neatest field experiences was we were at a river called Hoyet, and we were counting pink and chum salmon. It's this river that's about 1,400 meters long to this gorgeous waterfall. And so when you're doing salmon surveys, you divide the stream into what you call different reaches, and you stop after each reach and calculate, how many live and dead salmon you saw. And then you hike all the way to this waterfall, and you finish your count because the salmon can't travel above a waterfall that's this large. And then you kind of turn around and come back. And on our way up one time, there was this pink salmon that had been dragged up on the side of the bank, and you're in black and grizzly bear country no matter where you're going, and you're seeing bear sign all the time. But you see bears a lot less often than you might think if you're, being loud and making your presence known, which we were that day. And we had seen this pink salmon that was all bloodied, that had been drug up onto the bank. And black bears especially kind of like to peel salmon like bananas. And so this fish was still alive, and this bear had peeled back its skin, and we could see its heart still beating, which was incredible.
This is your favorite salmon moment?
It was so neat. And I felt quite terrible for this fish because its innards were completely exposed. But what opportunity do you ever get to see a salmon heart beating? And there's just blood all over the riverbank. And we were like, oh, yeah, we interrupted somebody's lunchtime. And so we carried on to the top of this stream with this waterfall. We had our own lunch, and then we turned around and came back, and the fish was gone by the time we came back. So we suspect that Mr. Bear was just in the forest watching us look at this heart still beating. It was very cool.
Okay, and last question. Title of the show, More Than a Fish. Both of you, why are salmon more than a fish?
Well, there's lots of reasons. I mean, not to steal from Allison's research too much, but I think you mentioned like how the river is delivering the nutrients, but like it's really the fish that are creating this like biological nutrient pump from the ocean. And for my work on juvenile Chinook salmon, the juvenile Chinook salmon that we catch in the estuary on their way out to the ocean are, they fit in the palm of your hand. They're 5 to 6 centimeters long. They're absolutely tiny. And then, when you go out and you see what like an adult Chinook salmon returning from the ocean looks like, just the sheer mass of it and the amount of mass gain that it's put on, and then it's bringing all of that back to the fresh water, to the predators that rely on it, and creating just that all of that amount of nutrients. You're just kind of going out to this vast ocean, gathering up nutrients that are all dispersed, and then bringing them back to the freshwater environment, and then being able to come back with 3,000 eggs and just like repopulate like an entire stream full of juveniles with all these nutrients that you brought from the ocean. I think is probably like the neatest part of what salmon are doing in the environment.
Yeah, for me, I struggle to think of another fish that has such a strong impact on life on land, and not just, in ecological communities, but also in human communities. I mean, like Dave said, you have got this enormous nutrient pump that comes back each year. And some of my research is looking at, how are these different ecological communities structured? The kinds of plants that grow on streams with more salmon are completely different species than the ones that grow on streams without salmon. And so salmon have this capacity to completely alter terrestrial food webs and community structure and all the different plants and animals that depend on them. But they also have had this incredible capacity over the last several thousand years to structure human communities and societies in the fabric of who we are. Yeah, I struggle to think of another fish that has the same kind of impact.
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap it up, both of you. Thank you so much to both of you for sitting down with me and having this conversation. I feel like we've had snippets of this before in various bars and restaurants, kind of over beers. And it was so great to like finally get everybody like down and ask you both all the questions I've had on my mind. So thanks again for coming on the show.
This was great. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
Raincoast Radio is hosted by Auston Chhor and produced by me, Sophia Osborne. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.